And once again, in the name of power, it's the weak and the women who must endure.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and let's talk about House of the Dragon Season 2, Episode 5. Now, this was a bit of a cool down after the big battle last episode, but it moved some very important chess pieces into place, setting the stage for Phase 2 of this war. I also want to talk about Alys Rivers and why exactly she's so obsessed with Daemon, and a little later, I'm going to get help from two Game of Thrones scholars, Brianna McLarty and Darren Robinson, to explain that ending and all of the hidden dragons in this show who are going to determine who wins this war. But first, I gotta praise this show for doing something that I think we needed to see more of in the original series, showing how the war affects these so-called small folk, or more importantly, showing how the war is in fact shaped by the small folk. In Game of Thrones, we do meet some commoners like Hot Pie. I love Hot Pie, but we always meet these people through the lens of noble blood. Every main character is of noble descent or serves somebody from noble descent, and we only ever see the small folk when named characters run across them. Even the term small folk implies that their needs are unimportant and that they are more like children.
Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone should be left to, well, everyone.
But this show has not only given us three important characters who are considered small folk, more on them in a second, but in this last episode they also show us how these small folk are key to these lords holding on to power. In the opening scene of this episode, Criston Cole has the brilliant idea to parade around the head of a dead dragon, and most importantly, we see how the small folk react to this.
It's just me.
Now, I do want to talk to Brianna and Darren about this later on, but remember, in the first season, Viserys clues us in on something important.
The idea that we control the dragons is an illusion.
The Targaryens were able to conquer Westeros because they convinced all the lords and the common people that they ruled that the Targaryens were closer to gods than men. They were essentially given license to break the laws of the church and intermarry because, as a divine people, it was better that their bloodline not be tainted. So in the eyes of the public, the Targaryens and their dragons were one. So now, by parading the head of a dead dragon, Criston Cole has actually sent the message that the blacks and the greens are not gods, they're not divine, they are in fact mere mortals. In the original series, we always heard about the events that were affecting the small folk. We heard that Stannis was blockading King's Landing. We would get the occasional shot of angry people in the streets heckling the royals. But here, we actually get to see moldy fruit. We actually see Hugh Hammer and his child, who he cannot afford proper health care for. We are seeing that the greens and the blacks are caught playing a game that will only hurt people who already had nothing. In the original series, we saw how the lies told by the villains affected the beliefs of the uneducated.
The Iron Throne's what I demand.
You cannot.
I can't.
You will not.
I will.
You dare not.
I dare, yes.
But in this show, we get to see commoners actually take sides in this conflict. For example, Ulf Wyatt loudly declares for Rhaenyra Targaryen.
To the one true queen, Rhaenyra Targaryen.
And yet, we see how the royals on both sides of the conflict constantly diminish the importance of these ordinary people. Otto Hightower wanted Aegon to appear as a benevolent lord. That's why he was furious when Aegon ordered the deaths of all the rat catchers.
And my grandson is a fool. He's worse than a fool. He's murdered innocent men.
And Aegon did this because he thought he was saving face in front of the commoners, when in fact, he was showing them that he was a cruel, malicious ruler. And it's that kind of nuance in this show that I truly love. And by the way, everybody, I just want to thank you so much for clicking this video and continuing to support our channel and these review videos, and for shopping at our merch store, ScreenCrushMerch.com, where we design all the merch ourselves. I am so excited to show you this RPG parody shirt where we poke fun at Daenerys for making a crucial mistake in the last season. She had the choice to either scout ahead for enemy ships or forget about the Iron Fleet.
Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
We also have our Team Green and Team Black baseball jerseys and lots of other merch for you to check out. Links are below. Now, some of the people who are in this show, we already know what happens with them because it's in the book. But the commoner that I'm most curious about is Alys Rivers. So in the book Fire and Blood, we hear about Alys, but it's always like a third-hand account and all rumors. All we really know about her is that she supposedly has lived in the Hall for a very long time, according to some rumors. I mean, some people even think she's been there for hundreds of years. And, you know, like we see in the show, she places Daemon under a spell. But the show gives us some new information about what's actually going on here. First of all, we see Daemon's enchantment seems to stem from this weirwood tree. So in the original series, we learned that weirwood trees were first worshipped by the Children of the Forest. And then, when the Andals invaded Westeros, they cut these trees down as part of their campaign to slaughter the children. Now, the trees have mystical properties, and the Children of the Forest use these trees essentially as a hyper-communication network across the continent. And in the original show, we also saw Bran use them to witness what happened in the past, present, present and future. Now, Harrenhal was built after Harren the Black ordered an entire grove of weirwood trees to be cut down. This is one of the reasons why people think the castle is cursed. Now, Daemon is sleeping in a bed made from the lumber of a weirwood tree, and he woke up touching one of these trees. So clearly the magic of these trees is tied into Daemon's visions. So the real question is, who is Alys Rivers and why is she messing with Daemon's mind? And what's the magical connection between her and these trees? So here's my theory. I think that Alys is one of the children of the forest. Maybe she's an ancestor of the children with mixed blood, which would explain why she looks human and has a long life. Or she could also be one of the children of the forest who is using a glamour, similar to the necklace that Melisandre wore in the original series. It's also interesting that she speaks with a Scottish accent. In the world of Westeros, where the island is essentially a metaphor for England, the wall in the north is a metaphor for Hadron's Wall separating England from Scotland. So her Scottish accent implies that Alys Rivers is not from the Riverlands. She is actually a wildling from north of the wall. And remember, in the original show, we saw the Children of the Forest had a refuge north of the wall, where they were protecting the three-eyed raven. So that's my theory on who Alys is, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what the hell Alys wants. So to answer that question, I am joined by ScreenCrush's own Brianna McClarty, and of course, Darren Robinson, who is an understudy at Second City and a Game of Thrones scholar. So Darren, I want to ask you first, what the hell is it you think Alys is, what does she want?
Well, okay, Ryan, if we're going to go with your Children of the Forest theory, which I think is really interesting, I think that she wants to destabilize the Targaryens. In the book Fire and Blood, we call it the Dance of the Dragons colloquially, but they also called it the Dying of the Dragons because as we saw in the last episode, the dragons fight each other and some of them do die and perish during this conflict. So that's very interesting. If you think that she's part of the Children of the Forest and working in tandem with them, perhaps she's trying to escalate this conflict so that House Targaryen tears itself apart from the inside so that we never get a prince that was promised and we're never able to stop the Night King. Because if we remember from Game of Thrones, the Children of the Forest were the ones who tied down that ancestor who was the first man or part of the first men. They tied him to a tree and they stuck that thing in his chest and he became the Night King. So I think she's trying to get rid of the Targaryens by having them get rid of each other. I think about the Children of the Forest kind of like, if you think about it in Terminator terms, like Alys Rivers is maybe the Terminator, and the Children of the Forest are Skynet, trying to stop the John Connor savior figure from coming into existence. But just, if we're going with your theory, on a deeper level, I think she's just a witch and she's a chaos agent. And I think she's definitely giving Daemon some drugs that are making it easier for Harrenhal to kind of run amok.
Got it. So yeah, I also, with my own theory, had a snag that I think you ran into. I want to ask you about. But before I go on, what are your socials? Where can people actually find you if they want to hear your thoughts on Hot D?
Yeah, you can find me at Instagram at Darren_2Dream.
So the problem I kept having here is, okay. So like you said, they created the Night King, but it's not like they wanted to create the Night. He ran amok, right? He's climate change. They create the Night King to stop the Andals from killing them and slaughtering them. They accidentally create this force called the Night King. Then the prince who was promised, which I think is a prophecy from Essos. I don't even think that's a Westerosi prophecy, is it?
Oh, it's from Essos, but it's a Targaryen prophecy that they came and they over Westeros. A lot of the Targaryens had kind of premonition powers, and so we saw like Aegon the Conqueror had a Song of Ice and Fire. Daenerys the Dreamer was the one who saw the doom of Valyria. Even Helena now can see events that before they happen. So
and
that's
maybe
kind
Viserys too.
Mm-hmm.
Viserys sees Aegon on the throne, and Daenerys has her own visions as well. But if that's the goal, though, if the Children of the Forest, like that we meet in the original series, they want to stop the Night King because they know it's their thing that's run amok. I didn't take it so much as having to do with the prince who was promised and the Targaryens. I thought maybe her motivation had more to do with just wanting the men gone. Because like I talked about earlier, Harrenhal was in this grove of weirwood trees. And if she is descended from them, or if that's where her magic comes from, I think she would just want to see all these people destroy each other. So I like your chaos agent theory probably more than I like my Children of the Forest theory, to be honest with you.
I was trying to back you up, Ryan, and I was trying to see if maybe there was a way to connect these things. But I think she really is just a chaos agent. I think she just is a nature person, like Brianna said in the last episode, and just maybe just wants to see the world burn.
I think it's wildling magic, though. You know, like the three-eyed raven and the tree were north of the wall. She's got a Scottish accent, which basically means she's north of Hadron's wall. I think it's related to that. I do think it's tied to the old magic of the weirwood trees. And I think there's a Children of the Forest connection in there somewhere, but I'm not going to necessarily die on that hill. Now, I do want to talk about like the ending of the episode and find out what dragons are out there and who could possibly ride these dragons and how we got to this point. But first, Brianna, I'm curious, what did you actually think of this episode?
I love this episode. I think the last episode broke my heart a little bit because Rhaenys was a queen, the queen who never was, but also just a queen in my heart. But I love this episode. I think that we're finally seeing how truly hollow the victory was for the Greens and how much they've just forgotten the small folk. And I think that's going to be their downfall because they aren't really considering the small folk at all. They're just they're treating them, this is going to sound bad, but they're kind of treating them like pets that will just kind of do whatever they want. But like Massaria said, they have a ton of power, partially because there's thousands of them. And I really enjoyed seeing Rhaenyra kind of step into her own and starting to really acknowledge the small folk because Viserys did care more about the small folk. And I think the best rulers of Westeros have cared about them. And I think I think this episode was a great setup for how the small folk will come into play in the greater conflict.
Yeah, and at the very least, you talk about rulers who like acknowledge the small folk. Marjorie Tyrell at least knew to play the game with the small folk and to earn that kind of thing. And like I was saying earlier, I think this is like a huge thing that the Game of Thrones original series missed, that the books focus on a bit more, like seeing the point of view of the common man. Brianna, what are your socials again? Where can people find you?
You can find me at Brianna T. McClarty, T as in Teresa, on both Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah, and like I said, I agree. The small folk are going to come into play in a big way. No spoilers from the books or anything, but we're already seeing more points of view from the small folk in this show than we ever did from Game of Thrones. I mean, we had the people that Arya met on her journey, but they were related to Arya's journey. Everything we saw in that show was through the point of view of these power makers and the people who inherited power. And I love how this show is showing us how, hey, there's like millions of people living on this continent that each of them go to work every day and have their own thoughts and desires. Darren, what did you think about this episode?
I thought, for me, the most interesting scene was seeing what happened on the Green Council with Alicent, and just seeing how the men just unanimously decide, no, it still needs to be a man on the throne. It still needs to be Aemond, and seeing the parallels in just her struggle with what she's doing with also Rhaenyra, seeing them, kind of as parallels to each other. They were best friends growing up, and seeing how they're both dealing with this situation in which all the men around them are doubting them. Even if they still follow Rhaenyra, you still have people like Sir Alfred Broom, who really kind of shows some defiance towards her in the episode. And she kind of has to put him in his place a little bit. And then we see with Alicent too, just that one scene where they were like, shut her down. Kristen Cole betrays her, shuts her down at the council. Loras betrays her, shuts her down. And then there's just the slow pan into her as she starts to kind of dissociate and become really depressed with that situation. So I thought that was a very interesting dynamic that happened in this episode as well.
We talked about that in our breakdown video, which you wrote, Brianna, that moment of choosing to focus on her feelings instead of on the goings on of the council, I also thought was absolutely genius.
It was amazing. And I think it really showed that she was realizing in some ways that the chatter of the council was unimportant to her because they are never going to value her opinion again. She seems to really fundamentally misunderstand that she only had power because Viserys wasn't sexist and let her have power. And it is very much like the meme that's, I didn't expect the panther to eat my face as the woman who voted for the panther eating face party. Like, she just doesn't seem to understand that she is now understanding that she set up a system that was just always going to kick her out.
And it's ironic that happened directly after Rhaenys' death. And I'm thinking back to season 1 where Rhaenys was like, have you ever considered yourself sitting on the Iron Throne? And how she's built this gilded cage for herself. And now she's seeing that it's gilded, but it still is a cage. And they're still not going to listen to her.
Oh, I love that. That is such a great metaphor. And speaking of Rhaenys, the marching of the dragon head, I thought was a perfect way to open this episode. We talked about it in our Easter egg breakdown, but also it showed the small folk, like they Kristen Cole made a mistake because he showed them the dragons were not gods. And I think that one scene and that one line, I think it was Hugh Hammer who said, it's just meat. I think that one line is laying a lot of groundwork for what's to come. But you're right. They also literally decapitated the Red Queen, the dragon.
Yeah.
So,
and it doesn't look glorious anymore. I think they did a really good job of setting that up, where the head looked gross, like you could see the innards, but then on top of that, there was like flies around it, and it was getting dusty. It was discolored, and so it
probably smelled.
I thought about that. I was like, oh. But it turned these dragons from these glorious beasts into like truly hunks of meat. Like they are like just like a dead body, and it's gross. Like a natural reaction is like, ew.
And the way the episode underscored that by like right behind it, you have Aegon's hidden body, right? Where you're basically, here's this symbol that Targaryens don't have their shit under control, that they are not gods. And directly behind that, hidden from public view, is a symbol that, hey, the people on our side are not gods either. I thought it was a brilliant pairing. And I love how we're seeing how the book presented things from this, propaganda point of view of he slayed the dragon when he didn't. We see in the show that it wasn't him, and it was this whole other complicated brother rivalry, and everything in this show always seems to go back to these interpersonal relationships, either between women in power or women and fathers or their mothers, or a brother to his other brother that he's jealous of. But let's talk about the ending, right? So talking about dragons, Jace and Rhaenyra have this conversation about, we don't need dragons, we need dragon riders. And they say, okay, let's pour through these books. I thought it was interesting that their first thought was, let's open up our tomes and look up lineages of people who are lords, who are highborn, when we know already that there is at least one baseborn person, Darren, who is walking around, who claims at least to be the bastard brother of Daemon Targaryen, and that's Ulf White. What do you think? I don't think, that's not a spoiler to say that. So can you explain to me why they have extra dragons, and like who those dragons are, and who are their riders, and what's their history?
Absolutely. So in season 1, remember the scene where Daemon goes and wakes up that one dragon, like he sings the song and the dragon shoots fire. That's Vermithor, who and this is probably the second or third largest dragon out there, behind Vhagar and the Cannibal. That's the other wild dragon that lives on Dragonstone.
We haven't seen in the show.
We haven't seen in the show
eats
yet.
Other dragons,
but eats other dragons. But Vermithor is also very big because he's very old, and he belonged to Jaehaerys, the old king.
So Vermithor, because the dragons, I think it's interesting. The dragons aren't just dragons. There's always like some symbolism to that. Like in our Easter egg video, Brianna, you talked about how Meleys and Vhagar were written by a husband and wife, right? By Viserys's parents. So it's a way of like also showing a symbolic civil war between this family, like this particular branch of the family. The fact that it's Jaehaerys' dragon Vermithor, right? What do you think that's saying, that dragon is unclaimed?
It just shows like how in disarray this house is. I think from, he had a long reign that was a peaceful reign. And so I think the symbolism of that is like the Targaryens have not been peaceful, have not seen peace really since his reign, because even with Viserys, he was a weaker king. And then after Viserys, now there's a civil war happening. So I think the return of Vermithor could signal the return of prosperity. I also think it's interesting that the Blacks want to claim him because Rhaenyra wears Jaehaerys' crown. She wears the golden crown of Jaehaerys, versus Aegon wears Aegon the Conqueror's Valyrian steel crown that has the rubies in it.
So Brianna, we hear, about Rhaena not having a dragon yet, and then Rhaenyra says, well, she almost died. Why is it these Targaryens can't just pick a dragon and hop on it like it's a horse? Is there another like symbolic meaning tied to this?
Yes, there's definitely a symbolic meaning, as well as just like a practical meaning of dragons are large and shoot fire, and horses can mess humans up by kicking them off, let alone a dragon. Rhaena doesn't have a dragon because her egg never hatched. Aemond also had the same thing. His egg never hatched. They always put in eggs with the babies, but like not that many dragon eggs actually hatched. She was going to take Vhagar after her mom died, but then, Aemond decided to be sneaky and take.
She was like waiting for an appropriate period of mourning before.
Yeah. And that's why they get in the whole fight. She's like, you took my mother's dragon and you took my dragon, essentially. She most likely tried to claim Vermithor or Silverwing since already tamed, but they do have a mind of their own. They can just decide they don't like a writer. I could say it's kind of similar to, honestly, when a dog just doesn't like you, except, again, much bigger and much scarier and can kill you. It's kind of like how Vhagar did pick Aemon. He decided, or she decided, I always want to say she decided that Aemon was a writer.
I know. Speaking of sexism, it's kind of sexist for us to think the largest, strongest dragon just has to be a male.
I know.
There's also...
I'll put respect on Grandma Vhagar's name. Respect on her name.
I love the Grandma Vhagar memes are amazing. And thinking about this, there's also symbolism with Viserys and his dragon, because he rode
Valerian,
the Black Dread, once. So this dragon, who was, the dragon ridden by Aegon and the oldest dragon to see Valyria, is a truly glorious dragon. And Viserys rides him one time, which symbolizes A, Viserys is his heart's not really in dragon riding and war, but also B, that those glory days of the past are behind him, and they're behind Westeros. So he would rather be near the dragon's skull than actually claim a new dragon and build his own kingdom. He's just building on what's been established in the past before.
Literally building, because he has that Lego set.
Exactly. So Darren, I cut you off a little bit ago. Talk about Silverwing. Where is Silverwing? Whose dragon was that? And what kind of symbolism can we extrapolate from its history?
Yeah, so Silverwing was Good Queen Alysanne's dragon. So that was the queen of Jaehaerys. So Remethor and Silverwing are, in a way, kind of a couple, like Jaehaerys and Alysanne were a couple as well. We haven't seen her in the show yet. I'm assuming that she is in the pit with Vermithor somewhere. But they have access to her as well, and she might come into play later. So she is riderless right now.
When you read the book Fire and Blood, this is not a spoiler for anybody. When you read the book, the Jaehaerys stuff was my favorite stuff. Jaehaerys and Alysanne were just good, solid rulers. They united the realm, they made peace with the church, they built roads, and Alysanne really was the realm's first and only advocate for women's rights at that point. If she hadn't died so early, I think Jaehaerys would have probably named Rhaenys as heir. So it's also interesting to see that not only were these dragons a couple, but the idea that this dragon is riderless is also showing that nobody really took up Alysanne's crusades for equal rights for women. I mean, I believe that prima nocta was still the law before Alysanne said, no, that's sexual assault and rape. You can't do that anymore. So she really, for her time, was a major advocate for women's rights. And would have been appalled to what's happening now. Go ahead, sorry.
Absolutely. And I think, honestly, I did love their reign, but Jaehaerys' reign is really where we start. As much as Alysanne was a big women's rights supporter, Jaehaerys had really terrible relationships with most of his daughters. And I think that legacy still trickles down, because almost all of his daughters either died, were estranged, or just had crazy stories that happened.
Ran off and became madams at a whorehouse in Lice, and did very well for herself. She got really wealthy by doing that.
Yeah.
One of them went riding in the night and
just
fell off her, fell into a wall and broke her neck.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, crazy stories of all of his kids slowly dying.
They had about 13 kids, and of them, only 2 would have been decent heirs, because they have another boy who just basically wanted to study and go to Old Town and didn't want to be involved with anything else, right?
Yeah, one became a one of the daughters became a septa, and one of the sons became a maester at Old Town.
Yeah. And an interesting thing about him is Jaehaerys, I don't think the book didn't say that he did, but I get the impression that he was extremely faithful to Alysanne and didn't spread any what we call dragon seeds. So avoiding spoilers for the book and for the show, Ulf White has claimed to be a dragon seed, which is somebody who is of Targaryen blood, right? Now, I don't think that Rhaenyra and Jace are thinking right away, hey, we should go get anybody with Targaryen blood. They want somebody they know they can trust, a lord they can recruit. Basically, if somebody's willing to ride a dragon into war, you could promise them anything. You could promise them a lot more than Harrenhal. So it'd be interesting to see how those characters kind of come into it. Why are there more dragons on Dragonstone than, say, in the Dragon Pit in King's Landing?
It's for a few reasons. One is that Dragonstone, unlike the Dragon Pit, which had to be built and is smaller, Dragonstone as an island just is actually pretty habitable for dragons. They have a lot of wild dragons. It's also where some of the larger and older dragons go. They aren't kept in the Dragon Pit. They can be kept on Dragonstone and kind of have like free reign in terms of just like being able to sort of like graze across the island. Like we see Sea Smoke, for example, he's just flying around. Everyone's just kind of okay with that. Occasionally they like eat livestock and that's rough. There's also just most of the dragon eggs themselves are like hatched essentially on Dragonstone. And we actually see in season 1 when Daemon actually finds a clutch of dragon eggs. So on top of that, a lot of dragons do actually hatch there unless they are the eggs that are put inside the crypts with the babies.
Gotcha. And Darren, you mentioned Cannibal earlier. Cannibal is one of the wild unclaimed dragons on Dragonstone. There's 2 others. Am I wrong there? Who are the others?
Yes, no, you're right. There's Grey Ghost, who's another one. And then there's also Sheep Stealer, who Brianna mentioned in a previous episode. Sheep Stealer is the one, a big brown dragon that steals sheep. And so we'll see what happens with Sheep Stealer.
Yeah. Every time I hear Grey Ghost, I think there's a great episode of Batman the Animated Series where we find out that Bruce's favorite cartoon when he was show when he was a kid was this adventure series about the Grey Ghost, and he kind of based Batman. It's a great episode. Batman the Animated Series, kids. Got to watch it. So that was really insightful, and I want to thank you guys so much for joining us. Again, Darren Robinson, Brianna McLarty. You can find their social links below. And hey, guys, if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.